to frame its own protocols for teaching and discussion. This was well summed up by the report of the Kottayam Commission on Higher Education in India in 1966, which noted that autonomy was needed in three spheres: selection of students, selection of faculty, and the selection of courses as well as themes of research. All three, in a sense, have been, autonomy in all these three spheres have been undermined. So these three levels at which autonomy was to be exercised was in relation to the university system as a whole, as well as to the funding body, the University Grants Commission. Now, drastic changes, however, are underway in the entire institutional architecture of higher learning in India. A slew of executive proposals, which include the elimination of the University Grants Commission, the UGC, the body regulating higher education for decades, and it's likely to be replaced by a new body called the Higher Education Commission, which will repeal the UGC Act. But besides this, 60 universities and colleges have been granted autonomy and have been designated as institutes of eminence as part of a concerted effort to change India's educational system. But interestingly, as we speak, none of the institutions of eminence projects has really taken off, as was promised that it would take off 2 years after its announcement in 2018, and we are now in 2022, and none of the proposals have really taken off. Now, the replacement of UGC with HECI, that is the Higher Education Commission, is essentially an attempt to further tighten government control over the higher education sector. The new commission will be a single umbrella body for the entire higher education system, excluding medical and legal education. Now, the proposed solution, many academics have argued, is much worse than what is being discarded, that is the UGC. Even though that was a humongous bureaucratized body, nonetheless, it was perhaps a little less prone to political control than probably the new commission is likely to be. So there are very legitimate concerns that the HECI will increase government interference, as government will use its discretion to reward and punish institutions according to its ideological preferences. And secondly, and interestingly, I just mentioned the institutions of eminence. The 60 higher education institutions that have been granted complete autonomy from the oversight of the UGC to start new courses and recruit faculty and students and so on, many of these universities did not even apply for the grant of complete autonomy. Why? Because, for example, the Aligarh Muslim University, the Banaras Hindu University, Jadavpur University were granted what is called graded autonomy without applying for it. Why do they say they did not apply for it, which suggests that they may not even want it? Is because autonomy at present simply means financial autonomy. And it's not just financial autonomy, it means that for financial autonomy to be exercised, the institutions have to raise their own revenue and resources, which will mean that the state would be shedding its responsibility of subsidizing higher education or treating it as a public good rather than a commodity. So these sweeping reforms, which I very briefly mentioned, will very profoundly affect the objectives of public education and of ensuring access and equity in the educational system. Now, the restrictions on institutional autonomy have also affected the selection of vice chancellors, faculty, framing of courses, and several other aspects of the functioning and administration of universities. the appointment of vice chancellors, and even sometimes now we are told the appointment of the faculty in central universities is being done under political influence. And the heads of many different institutions, especially the research institutions, tend to be people who have shown ideological compatibility with the regime in power. So important posts in just about all institutions are being routinely filled with right-wing nominees, most of whom, or many of whom, I shouldn't say most of whom, many of whom lack academic credentials. These are, of course, not the first instances of appointments of persons with proximity to the ruling party. Congress governments were well known for doing the same in the past when they were in power. But in the past, government nominees had a semblance of professional attainment to their credit, whereas many of the appointees today lack basic academic credentials or achievements. Now, my own university, the Jawaharlal Nehru University, a leading social science university, was a pioneer in academic autonomy. It was defined by several specific features, a certain degree of inclusiveness with regard to student intake, a certain emphasis on social sciences and the humanities, and an atmosphere of free discussion and debate. It was built as a self-regulating university with a high level of democratic participation of teachers and students at every level, starting with the student faculty committee in every center, which was an innovation, which was one of JNU's many innovations. That was the channel through which students' participation was organized. These committees were quite apart from the various unions that bring a different perspective to university affairs. What came out of this participative democratic structure was that consensus was built within the university community, from centers to the school and up to the university. So it was going from below to up, so to speak. But we know, sadly, that these democratic processes have collapsed in JNU. The university has been centralized to the detriment of democratic processes that had been established over the past 5 decades or so. The JNU simply does not function in the way, the JNU has not functioned in the way it is functioning now. Public universities like JNU produce a critique that does not always conform to the national consensus on major issues. At times, confronting the regime's notions of nationalism and questions the restrictions on academic freedom. From its inception, JNU has been home to critical ideas, questioning the dominant ideologies of power or even mainstream nationalism today. For this very reason, it has been targeted to silence voices that do not conform to the dominant ideological agenda. This brings me to the last set of issues, and that is why all this is so, largely because there is an anti-intellectual, anti-historical strain in the present dispensation's thinking and approach. And that is really, that anti-intellectual approach is the biggest threat to academic freedom and institutional autonomy. Now, so the biggest threat to academic freedom and institutional autonomy comes from the neoliberal corporatization of the academy, even though what we need is less of this and more public funding, scholarships, fellowships, and greater autonomy for a more inclusive university education, and above all, for cultivating capacities for critical thinking and the freedom to think and talk freely without being branded anti-national or seditious. Now, inviting foreign universities in this context, which is the latest proposal, although it's not such a new one, but it looks like it is gathering steam, and that is the inviting foreign universities to establish offshore campuses in India in this context is the latest attempt to quicken structural reform of higher education. Very few foreign universities have set up campuses in other countries. The few that have, like the New York University campus in Abu Dhabi, have received massive subsidies from the home government. Now, is this going to happen in India? Foreign universities are unlikely to open campuses in India without huge concessions on land or other resources, if not actual financial resources. The question is, should the government, which is cutting down on funding higher education, public higher education, give money to universities from abroad when it is not supporting its own? If they do, it will be the worst form of reverse discrimination at the expense of, especially at the expense of universities in India, especially public universities. This policy of inviting foreign universities to set up their campuses lays bare the fundamental conflict between two opposing trends: the government trying to reduce the autonomous and more liberal trend and the institutions that promote it, and encouraging private and foreign universities ostensibly to make high-quality foreign education available in India at a somewhat lower cost so that students don't have to leave and some of the millions spent to gain foreign higher education can be spent in the country. The new education policy clearly, as I have argued, throws its weight in favor of the latter, and thus foreign universities, and seeks to carry the process of privatization and exclusivity in higher education to its logical conclusion. The related aspect, which is a matter of some concern to people like us, is the systematic underemphasis on humanities and social sciences. Their significance has been reduced partly because they're seen as less useful in a world where economic calculations matter most, but also in part because they're seen to be more critical and therefore more trouble for university administrations at large. Ever since it took office, this government has been actively trying to snuff out criticism in the country. Reducing the significance of humanities and social sciences goes a long way in achieving that end. Humanities provides a crucial source of critical reflection and concern for the lives and interests of others, other than oneself, that simply cannot be provided by an education system concerned only with technical skills that have immediate economic application. Unlike the social sciences, history doesn't suffer from neglect under this government. Now, history is not my discipline, but now that history is everyone's concern, it is certainly my concern too. So unlike the social sciences, history doesn't suffer from neglect under this government. Revising history is an essential element of the plan to make Indians understand their magnificent, glorious Hindu past, legitimizing a kind of nationalist history that has been questioned by many historians. Nationalism and nationalist principles do not have roots in the ancient past, no matter how much effort we might make to push nationalism and democracy into the ancient past, because the new society that inclusive nationalism, as in the case of anti-colonial Indian nationalism, gives rise to is a response to current requirements. Inclusive nationalism is characterized, or was characterized by the presence of democracy, pluralism, and above all, equal rights that simply never existed in the past. The current project of history writing segregates citizens according to identity, and this marks a total rejection of India's cultural and political plurality and India's syncretic history. It is premised on the very deeply problematic idea of correcting historical wrongs by giving primary status to the group that counts as the majority, which is not the political majority, but a religious majority, and an attempt is made to reformulate history to uphold the requirements of this ethnic or religious majority of its citizens. Now, this sentiment has become the fuel for a new type of politics, the politics of grievance and division or divisiveness, which is said to lie in the idea that Muslims victimized and enslaved Hindus for the last 1,000 years. And we have very recently heard about this. However, Professor Ramila Thapar noted in her very recent, just last Saturday, in the C.D. Deshmukh lecture titled Our History, Your History, Whose History, which was a fascinating lecture on the relationship between historical research and majoritarian nationalism. And the historical researchers, she argued, that are researched by professional historians do not rejuvenate this imagined view of history inspired by colonial historians. She argued that to understand what is projected as religious antagonism and even victimization, she pointed out, and I quote her, it is important to look at the actual relations between the two communities to comprehend inter-community relations in the last 1,000 years. Contrary to this, the present rewriting seems to be driven by a desire to avenge the past, or majoritarian revenge seems to be the main driving force of the construction of current official history, in contrast, stark contrast, I should say, for instance, to Nehru's writing of Indian history, which, as a historian has pointed out, was done in a way to preclude even the slightest nationalist bigotry and distortion. Now, some of these distortions can be seen from the standpoint of the establishment attempt at appropriation of the nationalist inheritance of the freedom struggle and the vilification of some leaders who were in the vanguard of this struggle. The forces associated with the current regime played little or no role in the freedom struggle. Nonetheless, they are making an unmistakable attempt to seek a place in the freedom movement by leveraging, and I underline this, by leveraging the electoral mandate for a calculated reinvention of modern Indian history and most particularly the freedom movement. For this purpose, there is a constant appropriation of modern nationalist leaders and attempt to adopt political icons, namely Mahatma Gandhi, Sardar Patel, B.R. Ambedkar, Subhash Chandra Bose are among some of the key leaders they have sought to appropriate and present as their own, despite the sharp opposition of all of these leaders to exclusionary nationalism, which is being passed off as nationalism in the present. The entire emphasis, I might point out, of this attempt at appropriation is clearly on individual leaders, as though the movement and the struggles that they led and organized did not matter, nor the ideas and ideology they fought for. Such a framework is marked by an abandonment of historicism and its substitution with individuals and their heroism. Consequently, leaders replace the freedom movement and the people who were active participants in this movement. Finally, the most serious threat to the world of knowledge comes from anti-intellectualism that I mentioned a moment ago, that finds the very idea of thought and critical thinking reprehensible. This approach has been strengthened through a variety of methods and propaganda tools. To start with, intellectuals have been derided and turned into an object of ridicule. The dissemination of uncritical thinking is promoted by fake news and trolls, demonizing critics and glorifying the ruling dispensation and its leadership and its ideological proclivities. This was made clear by the recent UGC directive to vice chancellors and principals of colleges and universities, pushing the idea of lectures on the theme, India, the Mother of Democracy, on the occasion of the Constitution Day on 26 November 2022. In his speech on that day, the Prime Minister also referred to India as the mother of democracy, citing examples of the existence of a democratic ethos from Hindu texts and history, even though there is no evidence, absolutely no evidence to support this claim. Democracy came to India, as indeed to most countries, in modern times, together with nationalism and secularism. Nonetheless, the government especially is taking the opportunity of the G20 summit, which is happening in India in 2023. Through the G20 summit in 2023, it wants the world to know that democracy existed in India since ancient times, and India was the mother of democracy. The world better sit up and note this. But facts speak for themselves. As everyone knows, democracy and representation were discussed with the coming of the nation state, associated with the emergence of the middle class and the bourgeoisie, and the changes being introduced by capitalism. India established democracy after independence, but this was not preordained by the ideas and practices of centuries before. The establishment of democracy and universal adult suffrage in a society defined by caste hierarchy, social inequality, poverty, and oppression was a dramatic signal of political inclusion. I would in fact go far as to say it was a revolutionary principle which derived inspiration and strength from the freedom struggle and the national movement. The manifestation of this long freedom struggle was the adoption of the Constitution that instituted a polity of equal citizens. Dissent, pluralism, and accommodation was the cornerstone or the hallmark of the freedom struggle and became the very foundation of our nationhood as a fraternity of equals. These ideas are completely absent in the homogenizing mother of democracy project compared to the heterogeneous, pluralist vision of the freedom struggle embodied in our Constitution. Anti-intellectualism, then, in conclusion, is a fundamental tenet of right-wing regimes, which tends to undermine public discourse by attacking and devaluing education, expertise, and debate. Intelligent debate is impossible without education providing access to different perspectives, a respect for expertise when one's own knowledge is not enough. As I said, certainly my knowledge of history is not enough, and that is a recognition that should be there, that everyone doesn't know everything. A respect for expertise when one's own knowledge is not enough, and a rich enough language to describe this reality. Universities are critical because they provide skills and critical understanding, as they are above all about the promotion of reason, tolerance, and democratic debate. Instead, we are witnessing an obfuscation of facts and truth which can be sustained only through a resort to unreason, prejudice, and irrationality. This has reinforced a range of prejudices, especially communal prejudice, which is doing great harm to Indian education as it encourages the production of illiberal intellectuals. Far from producing organic intellectuals, it produces instead illiberal apologists for the regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for updating the concerns and also for pointing out the relevance of academic freedom in the context of autonomy of higher education institutes, and the importance of financial autonomy in the context of autonomy of higher education institutes. ഒരു പ്രധാന കാര്യം എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു, ഏറ്റവും ശ്രദ്ധയോടെ പ്രൊഫസർ പറഞ്ഞൊരു കാര്യം ഓർക്കേണ്ടത്, വിദേശ സർവകലാശാലകൾ നമ്മുടെ നാട്ടിലേക്ക് വരുന്നു. പൊതുഖജനാവിൽ നിന്ന് ഉന്നത വിദ്യാഭ്യാസത്തിന് പൈസ നൽകാൻ പുറകോട്ട് പോകുന്ന കേന്ദ്ര ഗവൺമെൻറ് എങ്ങനെയാണ് വിദേശ സർവകലാശാലകൾ വരുമ്പോൾ അവരെ സഹായിക്കാൻ പോകുന്നതെന്ന് വലിയൊരു ചോദ്യം നമ്മുടെ മുമ്പിൽ പ്രൊഫസർ ഉയർത്തിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. നമുക്കതിലേക്ക് പിന്നീട് വരാം. നമുക്ക് അടുത്ത സ്പീക്കറിലേക്ക് പോവാം. സോ വി ഹാവ് പ്രൊഫസർ MV Narayanan sir, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Sri Shankara University of Sanskrit Kaladi. Sir, please.